everybody. It's Larry Kotlikoff with Economics Matters, the podcast. I am delighted to have Eduardo Porter with me today as my guest. Eduardo and I have kind of interacted over the years. I guess he's called me a few times for background for some stories he's written, and I've just been keeping track of him. He's one of our country's leading writers, journalists, but editorialists, commentators. He's born in Phoenix, grew up in the U.S. and in Mexico and in Belgium. So everybody can hear this interesting mixture of accents, I'm sure, if it comes. He's been an economics reporter for many years for the New York Times and more recently for the Washington Post. I'm going to give you his bio up to like 2018, and I'm going to let him continue. First of all, he has written two outstanding books. American Poison is his most recent book, and then there's The Price of Everything. Both of these are highly recommended and deep. It's hard to find deep books these days that aren't just repeating the obvious. So he worked on the editorial board of the New York Times. It's a pretty high-level position. I keep getting rejected from the New York Times when I write columns, so thank you. He began his career in journalism as a financial reporter for Not to Mix, a Mexican news agency in Mexico. This is not exactly where you think you'd start to get to the top of the New York Times. It's a Mexican news agency in Mexico City. He was a correspondent in Tokyo and London. And in '96, he moved to Sao Paulo, Brazil, as editor of the America Economica, a business magazine. In 2000, he went to work at the Wall Street Journal in LA to cover the growing Hispanic population. As I mentioned, his books, and he lives in Brooklyn. And then after 2018, he moved to the Post, right? Is that the point?
No, actually, I left the Times in 2022 to work for Bloomberg Opinion, and I wrote a column mostly about international affairs, international economic stuff, Latin America, for about a year at Bloomberg Opinion, and then last October I moved to take a position on the editorial board and as a columnist, sort of like half and half, at the Washington Post.
Okay.
So now I'm writing, about kind of, again, broadly international stuff, climate change, global development, but also some U.S. economic policy.
Okay, so right now you're with the Post and covering a range of issues. Well, great that you have not even contemplated retiring because we need you, especially in these days. Where are you calling from now?
I'm calling in from Mexico City. Oh, because now, in fact, I live half the time in Brooklyn and half the time in Mexico City. This just started in April. I grew up in Mexico. My mother lives here. My sister lives here, and I had spent many, many years outside. So left Mexico, I don't know, 35 years ago. And now I'm back. So at least half time.
Wow. So tell us a little bit about your career, how you end up going from this small newspaper to the biggest newspaper in the world, or the most important paper in the world. And of course, the Washington Post might be arguing about that, but anyway, yeah, give us a story because it's good for people to hear about careers and the luck and the dedication, the effort, whatever it took. Maybe it's just some special juice you have.
Well, serendipity clearly played an enormous part in this. Just to take a step even further back, I did not study to be a journalist. I studied physics, and I at one point thought I was going to work as a physicist. But as I was doing my graduate studies, I decided that that really wasn't for me. I then tried to write movies for a little bit. I gave a shot. I wrote a little bit for a TV comedian in Mexico. And suddenly there was a job opening at this company, Notimex, to write about economics. In fact, to write about foreign banks, which is something I knew absolutely nothing about. But I don't know. I guess the numeracy from having studied physics helped. But what also helped was that the guy that ran the business section of this company knew me. And so he called me up. Would I be interested? And so I eventually got that job um, because I had some kind of like a familiarity with living in several other countries and so forth. Well, the idea of sending me to Japan came sort of like naturally to them, and they were also interested in the economic. This agency was very, very interested in the economic relationship between Mexico and Japan. At this point in time, Mexico was negotiating NAFTA with the United States and Canada, and so they were super interested in how this would filter across the world and whether it would draw investment and stuff. And so they wanted somebody that knew a little bit about economics, and I'd been writing for them about banks for a year. They figured I knew enough. I wanted to go back to London because I had done graduate school there. And so I kept bugging them, hey, now send me to London, send me to London. And eventually they did. And so that's where I got to be their correspondent in the UK. And then, again, it's really who you know. When I was in the UK, I started kind of freelancing for this business magazine in Latin America called América Economía, which was the majority shareholder at the time was Dow Jones, so it had some link to the Wall Street Journal of the US, but it was based in Santiago in Chile. And they were a Spanish-speaking thing that occurred in all Spanish-speaking Latin America, and they were interested in now creating a Brazilian edition in Portuguese. So I'm in London. I'm freelancing for them, writing a few pieces here and there. And suddenly they call me up. Would you like to come and run this Brazilian thing that we want to do? And so I said, yeah, sure. And that's how I ended up in Brazil with this kind of startup magazine about business. I did that for like 3 years. And then I asked my bosses because there was a Dow Jones connection, and I told them, well, look, it would make sense to have somebody in New York, in the belly of the beast. And they sent me to New York. And so it happened. I was working in the office of the Wall Street Journal in New York. And, in the World Financial Center back in the day. And the guy that had been the Wall Street Journal bureau chief in Argentina, which I had become acquainted with while I was living in Brazil, and we had become very friendly. We'd chat a bunch. He just happened to be returned to the US to be named LA bureau chief. And I ran into him literally in a corridor, and he said, dude, why don't you come work for me? And so that's how I ended up. I guess, he said, this is the Hispanic guy, because I am half Mexican. So the Hispanic guy covering the Hispanic market that we're very excited about in LA. So I ended up for the Journal for 4 years. And then just to give you the importance of who you know,
Right.
turns out that the Times had at the time, it had 3 econ writers. David Leonhardt, Louis Uchitel, and the guy called Dan Altman. Dan Altman was leaving the econ desk to go write editorials, and they needed an econ person. And it so happens that a guy that I had hired in Brazil from Bloomberg to work for this magazine, who had then become a stringer for the Time and then a full-time reporter for the Times, recommended me to take that job.
Well, Louis Chichel, I hadn't heard his name for quite a while. I used to talk to him all the time.
Yeah, well, he's been retired for a bunch of years now. Although I think I still follow him on Twitter. But yeah, Lou's not there. David Leonhardt has now moved on to higher a more commanding position, and I don't know where Dan is. But anyway, so there I'm at the time being an econ reporter.
He's with the Hill.
Oh, okay, okay. So I'm an economics reporter at the Times. and suddenly this guy Altman leaves the board. I think that's what happened. And suddenly there's an opening on the board to write about businessy stuff. And the guy, the guy that was the Sunday business editor at the Times would share a bus from New Jersey to the Port Authority in Manhattan in the morning commute. And the head of the editorial board, Andy Rosenthal, asks him, he was Tim O'Brien, would he recommend somebody to take that slot? And Tim recommended me. And so I ended up writing editorials. I ran it on the editorial board for, oh my goodness, like a bunch of years, something like 6 years, 5 or 6 years. And so, I wrote editorials mostly about biz, tech, monopoly policy, antitrust policy, and Latin America, because the person in charge of foreign wasn't really that into Latin America, so I kind of left that space to me. Then what happens? Then David Leonhardt had a column down in the newsroom called the Economic Scene column, and he was great at it. He got a Pulitzer for it, and fantastic writer. And he was made. There's a big change in editors at the time. Jill Abramson becomes the top editor. She sends David to be the Washington bureau chief. So suddenly there's a slot for the column. Within 30 seconds of knowing that David was going to be sent to Washington, I pick up the phone and I called the business editor, Larry Ingrassia, and I said, I want David's column. And it took Larry a little bit to think this through, but he ultimately agreed and he gave it to me. And so I left the editorial board and went back into the newsroom to write this column, which I did for 6 years. In 2018, kind of like as part of a reorganization at the Times, most of the newsroom columns were eliminated. So like the thought, I think, was more that columnizing was more appropriate for the opinion section and not for the news section. And so what I started doing is I started doing a little bit more long form writing. I became very interested in writing about the distribution of prosperity within the United States. Inequality is something that I had written about a bunch on the column. And so here, this kind of idea of geographic inequality, which places succeed and which places fall behind, became super interesting for me. And I wrote about that mostly since like 2018 through leaving to Bloomberg in 2022. That was, I would say, the bread and butter of my writing. Kind of longer pieces.
And then you spend like a year.
And then why did I go to Bloomberg?
No.
Sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no. Then I went to Bloomberg because I felt that I wanted to write commentary again. And the head of Bloomberg Opinion had been the head of op-ed at the New York Times when I was on the editorial board. He was probably one of the guys that rejected your columns because the op-ed people are really very difficult. So he ran op-ed, and my office and his were adjacent. So he would, have to bear my affinity for Led Zeppelin. So when I thought that I really wanted to write commentary again, I called him up. And so he invited me over to Bloomberg, and I joined him at Bloomberg. And like 24 hours after I arrived at Bloomberg, they offer him the job of editorial and head of the opinion section of the Washington Post. So I said, oh, bummer. And so I stayed for a year at Bloomberg, but then I tried to make my way to the Post. And so here I am.
There you are. Well, what
Sorry for the long,
So it's not just connection. I mean, connections are important, but you have to perform, and people like what you're writing. I don't think they were doing you any favors, but they obviously you go with people you trust, you spend some time with, you can rely on. And this is a tough, demanding job because you have to have you're facing deadlines, right? All the time. Yeah. This is pressure, and you can be up at 3 a.m. like I was last night, writing something to deadline. And so are you addicted to writing?
I love writing. It's the most fun part of the job.
Yeah, I think I'm addicted too. I mean, I just basically spend most of my part of my waking hours writing. And or researching. I'm doing, do research. So it's a combination of writing up research, but yeah, I find like I'm getting paid for having fun,
Yeah,
and
for sure,
which
for
is
sure.
really the best thing you could possibly hope for in a job. The
Yeah.
uh, Tell us a bit about these two books that you've written, and why people think that books that have been written in the past are somehow not to be read because they're in the past.
Uh-huh.
But that's like not saying like, well, I'm not going to read Shakespeare because it was written 500 years ago or something. Um,
Yeah, yeah, no. I think actually, I mean, and this is an honest, real thought. I do think that both of the books that I read are still very readable and still have something to say about our present. Um, they're very, very different. The first one, The Price of Everything, I had so much fun with. It was,
that's what
stuff
I
that
was
is
going to say.
probably,
That's the joke about economists. They know the price of everything and the value of
and
nothing.
the value of nothing. Yes, that
Was it?
was the quip upon which I wrote this, but it was actually pretty laudatory of economists' way of looking at the world. Frankly, this book, it was like how some sense of opportunity cost and relative prices underpins individual decisions, collective decisions, societal institutions, and so on. And I just wanted to work that argument through how what I viewed as like a little bit through the arc of history, as people kind of like try to figure out what things were worth and in a Christian context and into like more modern economic framework. And then I played with using that to talk about crime and the Gary Becker's approach to crime, which is very much in terms of opportunity costs and so forth, and about gender relations, about why people choose to belong to religions or not to belong to religions. I really try to push the envelope into the more kind of like not obvious places where this kind of thinking might not be evident at first blush, but that you are indeed always deciding one thing. Well, there's all these other things that you're deciding against, and that understanding can help us inform how we work. And then that one was super fun. That was like just go through the NBR archives all the way as far back as you can go, right? And pull out all these fantastic papers. And then talk to as many of their authors as you can. And that was quite lovely. I really liked it.
For those of you who don't know, the NBR is the National Bureau of Economic Research, and it's basically a clubhouse for economists. And when I was in grad school, Martin Feldstein was my thesis advisor, and he was appointed head of the NBR. It was a failing institution. There were about 10 older folks in New York, and uh, anyway, the whole thing was collapsing, and he took it over. And now it's a clubhouse with like 10,000 economists that get together uh, every summer for many weeks presenting papers. And there's the NBR working paper series, which is where you put out your paper before it becomes um, published. And uh, that, the number of working papers is, astronomical. It's like 100 a week or something, which is crazy. So nobody has time. So we're all writing too much. Nobody has time to read. But I was lucky enough to be a student, and he said, "Well, you six guys are going to be research associates in the National Bureau. Congratulations!" And that was that's how we got appointed. And yeah, I was very close with him. But he made it into a huge success. But anyway, it's it's a great resource for anybody who wants to learn about the whole range of things that economists are working on. And when you talk about the price of everything, I recently wrote a book called Money Magic, and I was talking about the putting a price on your love for children. I thought that
Uh-huh.
would be a little bit startling because we have software, and you could say, look, how much is an extra kid going to cost? I've got three already. What's it cost to have an extra kid? And if I choose not to, or what's the most I'm willing to pay or to give up my own living standard to have that kid? That's
Yeah.
the price of
Yep.
putting a price on a kid. that's what it is. And you're absolutely right. Everything could be, we think everything can be priced. We're just completely that nuts to think that.
Well, I think that in fact that people just intuitively do act on these things. They just don't articulate them like you just have. And I mean, there's the money aspect, but there's also like the time use. Your kid is not just going to be, involve some cost in terms of schooling and
Right.
feeding and so on, but also on your time. It's going to change your life in a variety of ways.
So,
And I do think that people ultimately do have this thought kind of like mushing around in the brain, even though that they don't, actually put it in dollars and cents and so on. And I find
let's
that
just,
quite fascinating.
let's just, kind of talk about this, fertility decision for a sec, because it is kind of relevant. We have, one political party that's kind of pushing traditional family, uh, relationships. Women should have kids, and you're getting yelled at if you're a woman without your motherless, uh,
Especially if you have a cat.
you're a cat woman who hasn't had her own kids. Uh, if you're taking care of other kids, it doesn't count. So you have to be home. You have to have kids yourself. You have to bear kids and therefore be out of the workforce and therefore not have the opportunity to get back into the workforce in the same way, give up your career, be stuck at home. That's, versus recognizing the opportunity cost of all those things, and which people have been doing. And that's why our fertility rate has declined. And in Europe, it's gone down like crazy. In, Korea, I think the fertility rate's 0.74. It has to be 2.1 to reproduce for the women to have at least one male, to reproduce themselves and the males. I always think that maybe they're just trying to have the females, not the males, but, um, and, they're not really interested in getting married or having
Yeah.
kids, let alone having kids in Korea. I mean, I've talked to enough young Korean women, on trips to Korea, that, it might be the machismo or whatever, uh, of the males, but even going out on a date is a big deal, like once a year for them. So what do you make of all this? Because this fertility crisis of the West is a very big long-term issue. And,
Yeah.
it's also happening in Russia, low fertility, Eastern Europe, like crazy. Uh, Places where it's not happening is Africa and, the fertility rate's coming down in Africa, but the population is going up because of the dynamics of demographics. Uh, North Africa coming down, but still huge
Yeah.
population increases projected because you have so many young people who are going to be giving birth, even though they're having fewer kids or so many having kids. That's the way the numbers work out. What do you what do you make of all this?
Well, there's so many, ways to go into this, but one thought that I had, it's clear. So there is this idea of the demographic transition, and that, it's kind of natural that people will have fewer children as the opportunity cost of having children increase. And that could happen not just because of the cost of the kid rising, but also the opportunities that you're losing out on becoming more valuable. And so, with technologies that first allowed women to take control over their fertility, and then that gave them opportunities in the workplace that they hadn't had before, that drastically changed the opportunity cost for women and for families. The fact that the economics of the world moved away from like very muscle intensive agricultural tasks that need lots of kids to maintain a family to one and where having more kids was not really that necessary for the family's well-being. Well, that also reduced the value of having kids. Because and now you wanted smarter kids, so that increased the cost of having each kid because you had to educate them all the way through university. So anyway, these changes have worked pretty much everywhere with varying speeds and whatnot, but it's this pattern has been pretty prevalent kind of all over the world, and places where the fertility is still much higher, as in Africa. Well, it's where these kind of like technological and economic transitions have happened slower or further lagging behind. And I think that understanding, broad understanding, is pretty much correct. I had like some additional thoughts of like, why does it fall so drastically in places like Spain and Italy? I mean, like really dramatically.
Right, these are
I have,
Catholic
and this
countries.
is just, sorry.
These are Catholic countries, also Ireland, right?
Well, there, yeah, there's you know, obvious. So the policy response to this would be to reduce the cost of having children, to change this cost benefit analysis, and one of the ways is by helping families have kids, and allowing making it easier for women to work even if they when they are mothers, and all these kinds of policies to support families and allow them to take advantage of of employment and so forth. And I think that that's been more difficult in these countries that have very, very traditional kind of like Catholic moral codes, where this idea of women being mothers and being workers is kind of still frowned upon. And so then many women have made the choice, well, if I can't do both, if this is not something that this society allows for, I'll drop the mother thing and I'll just, be a single person in the workforce and enjoying life that way. So that would be kind of my guess about why in some countries it has fallen so drastically. I really don't understand South Korea to the point that I could say anything intelligent about that. But I also think that probably in places like the Soviet Union would also be interesting. Russia is interesting because it seems to me that it's one of the modern societies that has invested more paradoxically in equality. I mean, the employment rate of women in Russia was way higher than in many countries in the West from a very, very long time ago. The education level of women was much more closely tied to men, when in places like the United States, there was still a very big gap favoring men, even though now that gap is flipped. But I don't know. And in terms of what do we do about it, gosh, I think that the track record of pro fertility policies is very bad. I mean, it's been kind of not been very effective at rising fertility rates. Even include a bunch of supports for childcare and even paying families for having the extra kid. I don't see it's moved the ball very much. So, I mean, I guess we hope for robots, right? I mean, in terms of what the workforce is going to be, I'm supposing that we're going to have fewer workers and more automation.
Let
And
me,
at least for a little while, I think immigration is going to be a part of the solution in some of these countries that have, high incomes and low fertilities. We don't yet understand it. The politics are not there. But in terms of just the economic argument, the argument for immigration is stronger than ever.
yeah, I mean, if you think a little, about what Vance is saying and Harris is pushing and Walls are pushing for childcare, increased child tax credit and an increased child care credit, I believe, and more family leave. Now, that didn't happen under the Trump administration, although there was some talk about that. But that's certainly one approach, which is let's make it easier to have kids. The other approach is let's lock people into having kids, and let's do the handsmaiden tale. Do you see that as our future, or do you think that technology could be such that we could actually just be producing kids in test tubes, grab an egg, grab a sperm, put them together, call it a day. Here's our kids. Everybody can go about their way.
When I think of technology, that's not what I'm thinking of, by the way. When I think of technology, I'm thinking about, like, say, Japan, which has had a very declining fertility rate for some time, very old population, and a labor force that has shrunk relative to the total population. And so there you're getting robots, right? And there's a more intense use of automation there. And even in settings that would have been considered impossible a few years ago, like personal care for the elderly, well, now you get these kind of like interaction robots that are supposed to accompany you and stuff like that. So that's what I think in terms of what the step for automation to replace a shrinking labor force. I mean, I guess you could, we could think of like the Matrix, and we could plant people made by some chemical reaction there and just make them. That I think is a bit further off.
I think I
I mean, the
read,
reverse thing. The handmaid thing, that I mean, I know that that American politics have gone down a very, very strange route, and we're hearing stuff that I can't believe that we're hearing about, repressive solutions or repressive policies to force people to do things like have children. Um, I don't expect, I mean, I am not a great political analyst, but I can't see how this becomes the norm in this country. I mean, say even if Trump and Vance were to win, I can't see like this. So, for instance, a federal prohibition on abortion or things like this. I really can't see this becoming a standard part of American society. It's just like too medieval somehow. Uh,
Well, the just a couple of stats that come to mind. One is that I think I just heard recently on the news on the radio that or read that something like 40,000 Japanese older people had died in their homes by themselves, and for like 3,000, it took weeks for them to be discovered. Uh,
yeah, yeah,
so that's and then the the Korean population is around 56 million. It's projected to go down to 12 million by the end of the century. So we're talking major impacts here for people's, welfare. Um,
yeah,
I think that whole one China policy is, they're actually in China, they're free to have more than one kid, but they're not. They're having fewer. The fertility
yeah,
rates actually dropped as they reduced that restriction. So, but part of keeping foreigners out, keeping Mexicans, all the rapists and all you folks who are just the worst of the worst, right? From our
yeah,
from our native shores, right? As if I
yeah,
were born here, right? My ancestors, well, they did come a while ago, but they weren't here with the Mayflower exactly. And um, yeah, it's that's racism, and the racism that's involved, perhaps underlying the invasion of Russia into the Ukraine, is to basically grab some more White Russians, or
uh-huh.
make people that could be turned into White Russians, not as in White Russian from you know, from uh, the war in Russia back in 1918 or whatever it was, but light skinned Russians as opposed to uh, Muslim Russians
Yeah, yeah.
from the provinces. So, do you think that might be playing a role here in what's going on in Ukraine?
Huh, that's a very interesting thought. It does seem to me that Putin has had this view that there exists this greater ethnic Russia that comprises big chunks of Ukraine, if not all of it. And also, I don't know, maybe Belarus and some other bits of the former Soviet Union that he now considers a great mistake that were let go when the Soviet Union collapsed, and they should be brought back into the fold. And, so he views himself as some, born again Catherine the Great that just kind of like reestablishes this ethnic empire. So for sure, I think that is definitely part of it. I don't know how much this is articulated as the motivation for the war, but yeah, I mean, I think that's very much close to his heart. Yeah. Um, but I think that, by the way, I think those sentiments are pretty universal, right? It's the sense of kind of like racial hostility, this us v them type of frame of the world, and where you belong to a certain ethnic, cultural, religious kind of polity, and you become very, very hostile to sharing resources with anybody outside of this group is common in the United States. You're seeing it flare up massively in liberal Western Europe, and of course, all across the developing world. And I think it's become way more salient recently. And I think I would argue that that's one of the main causes for this kind of turn to authoritarian populism that we're seeing, pretty much everywhere.
So Ben Friedman, who's a professor, I don't know if you probably know Ben at Harvard, an economist, but he does work on a lot of pretty deep topics. His view is that these kinds of movements of racism and tribalism have occurred during periods of slow growth, where at least the bottom half did not see progress. So they saw progress more in, let's say, keeping others from getting their pie or grabbing more of their own of the pie that was there, but not sharing it with anybody else coming into the country. And this certainly in recent decades, you probably go back 30 years, are if you look at the median weekly real earnings of US workers, median, so half are above and half are below, as you obviously know. Just trying to, not everybody here is used to all these terms. That median wage has not risen by more than 10%, has risen just 10% over like 30 years. That's basically nothing, okay? So we basically have half the population just doing, not improving, or some in that group might be doing a little better, some might be doing a little worse, but then the other half has been succeeding like crazy because per capita GDP in the US has gone up dramatically. So wage inequality has risen dramatically. At the same time, so we have like two groups trying to feed off the same segment, the aggrieved, right? We've got the Democrats wanting to basically give them more from those who've benefited through time, and the other group wants to keep others out so they can and put on tariffs. We only have 8% of our workforce in manufacturing. It used to be 1950 was 30%. Under Trump and under Biden, the share of employment in manufacturing has continued to decline, not at a more rapid clip, but it's just a steady trend. What the hell are they thinking? Are they going to think we're going to suddenly make, I just bought a trimmer for my hedges. It's like $70. It came from, I don't know, China or somewhere. It would take an American worker at a minimum wage would probably take a week to make, even with the best equipment. I mean, just the cost would be astronomical compared to what I bought it for on Amazon. It was here the next minute.
Yeah. It's crazy. And interestingly, that actually JD Vance is specifically making the call for Americans to buy American clippers and American toasters and American refrigerators. I mean, he is very specifically making this argument, which I agree is kind of like nonsensical. And not only because of that, is because now most manufacturing is super, super capital intensive. So you can bring back the building of a bunch of things to the United States, and your employment in manufacturing is really not going to move very much.
Could go down.
Using machines to make the stuff.
It could go down. They'll set up a new Well, hey, we're getting subsidized or being protected to put up this factory. Great. We'll get rid of all these older workers who are not that productive and just hire smart machines. In your second book, American Poison, tell us about that, how that connects to
well, that's precisely connects to what we're talking about now, the sense of us versus them. And that's what I wanted to explore about how this kind of like embedded, very deep-seated racial mistrust, racial hostility, racism. I mean, there's a variety of words that are not exactly synonymous, but they're kind of like it's a little cloud of hostility, mistrust, skepticism, envy, fear, have shaped the US, have shaped American institutions in a way that I think has not been sufficiently acknowledged. Although in recent years, I mean, I do think that there's an explosion of interest into the role of racism in the US history and US society. I was writing this in 2019, where there was already the Black Lives Matter movement was already up and going, but I think it was the killing of George Floyd that really made this into kind of like a tsunami of interest in how this how racism had played a role. And I think my book takes a different path from how the politics of anti-racism have evolved. I kind of like see this, I look at this and I see this as a deep sociological, anthropological kind of force that needs to be worked with, and I just try to work my way through how did it affect, housing policy, constitutional amendments, all sorts of different ways in which the U.S. works were actually shaped by these thoughts. I mean, the union movement, how it was shaped by racial hostility. I mean, the union movement was extremely hostile to invite workers of color in back in the day, right? And zoning policies have been totally affected by racial hostility, and it's this notion
Right.
of us versus them that we were talking about a moment ago. And one thing that I would point out is even though I agree that the economics are important, that slow growth and a smaller pie or a pie that's not growing as fast is gonna exacerbate these tensions. I don't think it's a sufficient understanding of this. I think that other changes, and in particular right now in the United States, where you see that the white non-Hispanic share of the population is kind of like shrinking year by year, and it's going to flip into less than 50%, I don't know, 15 years from now. Or that is, I think, also one of these it's a contributing factor to create this sense of imminent danger that leads, white mostly rural or semi-rural populations to think that we have to circle the wagons and keep migrants out, and leads them to favor the kind of discourse that Donald Trump is offering.
Yeah, I mean, from my vantage point and from yours, you've had so much international experience and just even within, where you work, you see people from all parts of the world working equally efficiently, perfectly efficiently right with you. The idea that, uh, that we would think that somebody's inferior because they come from here when, as an economist, I see the most brilliant uh, economists, and you cannot predict where they're from. It could be from
Yeah.
Colombia. They could be from Turkey, for Armenia. I just had Daron Acemoglu on just on the podcast the other day recording. Uh,
Brilliant. Yeah.
I mean, the guy's probably the top economist he was the top economist under 40. He was voted that. He's certainly probably the top economist under 50. He'll probably be the top economist through his entire life. He's producing okay, he's
Yeah.
from some remote part of, as I recall, of Turkey or,
Turkey. Yeah.
yeah. Uh, I mean, it's just, and then the contribution that he's making to so many other people in their research, the externalities. Uh,
Yeah.
this is what I think needs to be conveyed. Not so much discussion about whether our wall is going to be bigger than your wall or whether we're now enforcing the wall, but let's talk about what immigrants are contributing. And let's remember that every damn one of us is an immigrant, except for the Native Americans who were also probably, came from somewhere. I mean, you know, uh, be thankful for the diversity because, my vision here is Donald Trump living in the Trump Tower with tariffs a zillion percent for everything and has to do his own gardening somehow in the lobby. That's that's what I think he should be condemned to for a couple of years, so he understands the value of free trade. I
Yeah.
mean, this is like first order stupid to think that you can produce everything and you can be the best of it. You can be better. You might be the best of everything, but you're not going to be relatively better. We learned that from David Ricardo back in 1820. That's the
Yeah.
basis of of trade.
Yeah.
Who trade
No,
does
for
what.
sure. For sure. But I actually, I've got to admit that I have become increasingly skeptical that making the argument from the economic gain and the gain in economic well-being that immigration brings about will actually be sufficient to turn the politics. Because this problem, this rhetoric that we're hearing now, this debate that we're hearing now, is old as the hills. I mean, we were having it in the United States in the late 19th century. I mean, Chinese Exclusion Act. We had the 1924 Immigration Act that basically set quotas on which people could come to try to keep the immigration down and to keep it white. You know, we've been, and these are the way that you go back into the record and look at how these policies were articulated. It was always an us versus them that was kind of divorced. I mean, sometimes you could make an argument that sometimes the argument will be made, oh, they're reducing the wages of domestic workers, which in turn actually is not true. But sometimes but oftentimes it's not even this kind of like reasoned economic thing. It's just that they're bad, like the Trump argument, they're rapists, which is actually false as well. But you know, it's more about an emotional reaction to some feared foreign force than a really reasoned kind of cost benefit type of approach. I remember I did some reporting in Appalachian, Kentucky, um, and which is a very, very red state, as you know. And you know, one of the things that I was interested in is well, why was there such a strong reaction against immigrants and immigrants getting Medicaid when there are no immigrants in Kentucky, in Appalachian Kentucky? I mean, I was in a county that was like 99.7% non-Hispanic white, and I was hearing arguments about how immigrants were draining Medicaid, you know, and so so that actually could offer a thought for a solution about these things, because I think that when these categories become abstract, like Hispanics or immigrants or people of color, rather than concrete people that are John and Mary and Eduardo and you know and they're on, it's easier to demonize.
So I
Once
bet
you're
they were,
Ron and Eduardo, you're the neighbor. You know, you said hi in the morning. You can see the guy, you know, walks just like I do, and you know, sort of. It's
so they were nice to you.
yeah, exactly. It relates to you kind of like as a people. And so I do kind of think that that would be very helpful if we could get more. And that's why I guess cities are much more open to immigration and whatnot, because cities are pretty much melting pots. Whereas if you go to big chunks of rural America today, they are very certainly white and old.
Yeah, I remember taking a taxi in Dallas from the airport, and this lady was ranting against Obamacare for half an hour, and then she started talking about her son and her son's medical condition, and uh, and I started asking her what kind of health plan he was on, and because he had a job and so he wasn't on Medicaid. I explained to her he was on Obamacare, and suddenly the conversation changed. The yeah, well, I'm an educator, so I think that people are, you know, just need to be informed, and we're talking down too much to people from both sides. We need to elevate the conversation, and but anyway, we have a couple minutes left, maybe like five. What's your prognosis of the election? Do you think, are you optimistic about the future of well, you're not adopted, you're American citizen, but
Yeah.
you're moving to Mexico, you're moving gradually or partially away from our country here. What is this saying?
Well, the politics here in Mexico are also pretty dicey. So, you know, it's hard to actually make this choice.
Now you have
But
a female president, right?
she's taking office a little less than a month from now. Yeah.
Well,
But we're in between now and then we're getting this set of reforms that's going to totally eviscerate the judiciary and threatens with ending checks and balances, and that's not a good thing. But anyhow, to the US, as of last week, I was very optimistic. I think I was still riding the sugar high out of, you know, the Joe Biden stepping down and allowing Kamala Harris to become the presidential candidate for the Democratic Party, and then the convention, and I very much support her candidacy. But as of the last poll that I looked at, which has them like totally neck and neck, and her seemingly losing momentum in some key states, say like Pennsylvania, that does scare me. Um, Part of me finds it kind of unbelievable that after having experienced the Trump administration, people would go out and vote for him again. It's just like something that I cannot possibly, I find it very, very difficult to get my head around.
Let me give you one possible explanation, okay,
Mm.
for people at the lower end of the income earnings distribution. You have, and this is kind of out of research, so I'm not just, making this up, but we have about 500 fiscal programs in our country, federal and state. So every state has their own Medicaid, their own food stamps, their own Obamacare Every county has their own Obamacare uh, program, actually, given the way it's set up. So we have this uh, system where we've told lower income people, lower wage people, guess what? If you work, we're going to give you these benefits, and we might even help you a little bit if you earn a little bit of money. But if you earn too much money, you're going to lose food stamps. You're going to lose uh, Section 8 housing. You're going to lose welfare. You're going to lose child tax credits. Not maybe it's not 100%, but maybe it is 100%. In some states, it is. You
Yeah.
earn a dollar too much, you're going to lose Medicaid. You're going to lose your Obamacare subsidy. If you add all this up, we've got about a quarter of the poor in 60% or higher marginal tax brackets. Some are like 20%, 20,000%. So we're locking the poor into poverty. Now, to me, that if I were in that kind of setting, I would be very frustrated by yet another Democratic administration or another Republican that wants to add more of these programs to save me. Okay. Because all these things are doing is locking the prison door, as opposed to thinking big. How are we going to take this entire mess of this fiscal structure, throw it away, and build from scratch so that everybody has an incentive to work?
Mm-hmm.
uh, and actually make it more progressive and more. I think we can do it because we haven't designed. It's like having 500 people build the Brooklyn Bridge with their own design without any coordination. It's going to
Yeah.
collapse, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
that's what we have. I think we can take it down and build a bridge that would actually hold. And then people, so I think if she were to talk big and think big, that's my view, that she needs to articulate major reforms to Social Security, to healthcare, to that people can see actually would trans. And she doesn't have to actually say this is exactly it, but this is what I'm thinking about. We have to do something big, but I think it's more of the same. I
yeah.
have a sense that people think she's not thinking big enough. That's my sense.
That's possibly right. I mean, she has been criticized for not coming out with her own, thoughts on
Yeah.
policy. And the latest poll that I saw had a very large number of people saying that they did not know what she stood for. They did not know what she would bring to the table. And yeah, evidently that kind of calls for some big statements of what she wants to do.
But
Thing
also
is, the weird thing is
that
that on the other side, the big statements you got are not like, let's rebuild something in a more rational way. It's like, let's just destroy a bunch of things, and that's great. I mean, good luck with deporting 11 million people, right? It's
it's, I know it's crazy, but I think she's surrounded by too many holdovers from
yeah,
or Hill staffers or lawyers who just cannot see the whole picture in any comprehensive way. I mean, no, but it's anyway. I'm frustrated by that, but
yeah,
it is what it is. Let's
yeah,
hope for the best with the election.
yeah.
And Eduardo, it was a marvelous privilege to have you.
Yeah, super, super
So
great. Thank you so much for inviting me
we
on.
will stay in close contact on
Will do.
on the other side. Okay.
Okay.
Of today, not of life. Okay.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, definitely.
Okay. All
So
right,
take
man.
care, Larry. Great to talk to you.
Take care. Take care. Bye bye.